Welcome, dear listeners, to Miss Marple, Killer at Redwick Parish Hall, a Miss Marple Mystery. Settle into your favorite armchair with a cup of tea as we journey to the quaint village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s. Here, amid blooming gardens and whispered gossip, our beloved Miss Jane Marple unravels a puzzling murder with her unmatched wit and keen eye for human nature. This cozy tale of intrigue and village life is perfect for a relaxing evening. Narrated in 10 chapters, each about 8 to 10 minutes long, we'll uncover clues together. And now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, was a picture of timeless serenity in the autumn of 1952. Its thatched cottages, with their ivy-clad walls and crooked chimneys, stood like sentinels along winding lanes, where the scent of wood smoke mingled with the crisp bite of falling leaves. At the heart of this tranquil hamlet stood Redwick Parish Hall, a modest structure of weathered gray stone, its leaded windows aglow with the warm flicker of lamplight on that fateful October evening. The hall was the epicenter of village life, a place where baptisms, fetes, and the occasional heated parish council meeting unfolded with predictable rhythm. Tonight, however, the air carried a subtle undercurrent of unease, though none could have predicted the tragedy about to unfold. Inside, the hall buzzed with the quiet energy of the annual Harvest Fete Committee meeting. Long oak tables, polished to a sheen by generations of diligent church volunteers, were strewn with papers, teacups, and plates of homemade shortbread. A fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls, adorned with faded photographs of past fetes, and a brass plaque commemorating the hall's opening in 1897. The room smelled of brewed tea, lavender polish, and the faint musk of old hymnals stacked in a corner. Villagers, dressed in their sensible tweeds and woolens, chatted in low tones, their voices blending into a comforting hum, like bees in a summer garden. Sharper tongue were softened tonight by a practiced smile. Her navy dress, adorned with a single pearl brooch, spoke of understated elegance, though her hands fidgeted with a lace handkerchief, betraying a private agitation. Next to her sat Mr. Reginald Poole, the church warden, a gaunt man in his 60s with a face like a ledger, stern, precise, and unyielding. His fountain pen scratched notes in a leather-bound book, each stroke as deliberate as his disapproval of frivolous spending. Across from them was Dr. Amelia Croft, the village physician, a woman in her early 40s whose poised demeanor and tailored green suit set her apart from the homespun villagers. Her dark hair was swept into a neat chignon, and her calm, assessing gaze suggested a mind accustomed to diagnosing more than physical ailments. Beside her, young Tommy Baxter, the gardener's assistant, shifted restlessly in his chair. At 22, his boyish charm and tousled blonde hair made him a favorite among the village girls, though his roguish grin hinted at a past not entirely free of mischief. Finally, at the table's end sat Miss Lydia Finch, the spinster organist, her frail frame swathed in a gray cardigan. Her fingers, gnarled from years of playing the church's ancient organ, clutched a teacup that trembled slightly, as if echoing some inner turmoil. In a quiet corner, seated on a cushioned chair with her knitting bag at her feet, was Miss Jane Marple. To the untrained eye, she was merely a frail, elderly spinster, her white hair neatly pinned beneath a felt hat, her blue eyes mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Her hands moved rhythmically, needles clicking as she worked on a pale pink shawl. But her attention was far from the wool. Miss Marple had been invited by Mrs. Hargrove to offer her opinion on the flower arrangements for the fete, a task she suspected was a pretext. The vicar's wife had a habit of drawing Miss Marple into village affairs when tensions simmered, and tonight, the air felt thick with unspoken rivalries. Miss Marple's gaze flitted from face to face, noting the small detail, countered brightly. "Oh, Reginald, a few extra flowers won't bankrupt us. The village expects a spectacle." Her tone was light, but her eyes darted to her husband, seeking approval that did not come. Dr. Croft, in her measured way, suggested a health booth to educate villagers on modern medicine, a proposal that drew a skeptical glance from the vicar. "We must focus on tradition, Doctor," he said, his voice firm. Miss Finch, usually silent, murmured something about the organ needing repairs before the fete's hymn recital, but her words were drowned out by Tommy's enthusiastic pitch for a scarecrow competition. The room buzzed with competing voices, each person vying for their piece of the fete's glory. It was then that the unthinkable happened. Reverend Hargrove, who had just lifted his teacup for another sip, paused mid-sentence. His face contorted, a sudden grimace replacing his usual genial expression. The cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the oak table with a sound like a gunshot. Tea splashed across the papers, dark and steaming, as the vicar clutched his throat. A guttural gasp escaped him, his eyes wide with shock, and his face turned a sickly shade of purple. He staggered, knocking over his chair, and collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. The room erupted into chaos. Mrs. Hargrove screamed, her handkerchief fluttering to the ground. Mr. Poole froze, his pen still poised over his ledger. Tommy leapt to his feet, knocking over a chair, while Miss Finch let out a faint cry and shrank back. Dr. Croft, with the calm of a seasoned professional, was the first to act. She knelt beside the vicar, her fingers searching for a pulse, her face pale but composed. "He's gone," she said after a moment, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "It's poison. Cyanide, I'd wager, from the smell and the speed." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the relentless ticking of the hall's ancient clock. The villagers stared at one another, their faces a tableau of shock, fear, and suspicion. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, set her knitting aside and leaned forward slightly. Mind was already at work. Poison, she thought, was a peculiarly intimate crime, requiring knowledge of the victim's habits. The vicar always took his tea black with a single spoonful of sugar, a detail known to everyone at the table. The teapot had been filled just before the meeting, and the cups distributed by Mrs. Hargrove herself. Yet the poison had found its way to the vicar alone. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if itching to unravel the knot of this mystery. As the villagers whispered and the clock ticked on, Inspector Craddock arrived, his heavy boots echoing on the stone floor. A young man with a no-nonsense air, he surveyed the scene with a frown. "Nobody leaves," he ordered, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He turned to Dr. Croft. "Poison, you say? Any idea how it got here?" "Not yet," she replied, her tone clipped. "But it was deliberate. Cyanide acts fast, within minutes." Miss Marple rose quietly, her movements unhurried. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice like a gentle breeze, "you might wish to examine the teapot, and perhaps the sugar bowl." Craddock raised an eyebrow, unaccustomed to elderly spinsters offering advice. But he nodded. The villagers dispersed to their homes, shaken and whispering, as the hall was cordoned off. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes lingering on the shattered cup, the faint initial etched into its rim. The mystery of Redwick Parish Hall had begun, and in the quiet of her mind, Miss Marple was already threading the needle through the fabric of human nature, searching for the pattern that would reveal the killer. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. The morning after the tragedy at Redwick Parish Hall dawned with a reluctant sun, its pale light filtering through a veil of mist that clung to St. Mary Mead like a mourner's shroud. The village, usually alive with the cheerful bustle of daily life, was subdued, as if the very cobblestones absorbed the weight of the vicar's death. The air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, mingling with the faint tang of chrysanthemums from cottage gestures. But in the quiet corners of human behavior, the overlooked glances and unguarded words, her morning walk took her past the village green, where sparrows chattered in the ancient yew tree, and toward Redwick Parish Hall. The hall's stone facade looked somber in the daylight, its windows dark, as if mourning its own role in the tragedy. A constable stood guard at the door, his youthful face strained with the gravity of his task. Inside, Inspector Craddock had set up a makeshift office, his desk cluttered with papers and a thermos of tea. He was a sturdy man in his 30s, with a practical air and a mustache that seemed to bristle with determination. When Miss Marple entered, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, and her eyes bright with quiet curiosity, he looked up with a mix of respect and mild exasperation. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, rising. "I suppose you've come to offer more observations." His tone held a hint of skepticism, but Miss Marple's reputation for unraveling village mysteries had preceded her. "Merely a concerned citizen, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "But I couldn't help noticing last night. The vicar's cup was the only one affected. Someone knew his habits well. He always took his tea black with 1 spoonful of sugar." She paused, her eyes meeting Craddock's. "You might consider who handled the teapot." Craddock rubbed his chin, considering. "An accident, perhaps? Contaminated sugar?" But Miss Marple shook her head gently, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Accidents, Inspector, are rarely so precise. Cyanide requires intent." She stepped toward the oak table, now cleared of its chaotic aftermath, and pointed to the spot where the teapot had stood. The handle was smudged, as if someone wiped it in haste, and the sugar bowl, slightly askew, don't you think? Craddock followed her gaze, his skepticism softening. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. We'll test." Penchant for fine dresses and London trips had clashed with the vicar's frugality. "Dear Eliza," Miss Marple said, settling into a plush armchair, "it must be a terrible shock. But tell me, who prepared the tea last night?" Her tone was gentle, almost incidental, but her eyes missed nothing. Eliza hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "I did, of course. I always do for committee meetings. But I used the same pot for everyone. How could it be poisoned?" Her voice rose, defensive, and Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, filing away the detail. Next, Miss Marple visited Mr. Reginald Poole at his austere cottage near the church. The church warden was in his study, surrounded by ledgers and account books, his thin frame hunched over a desk. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice as sharp as his pen, "this is a calamity. The vicar and I had our differences. He wanted to splurge on the fete, you know. But murder? Preposterous. His eyes darted to his ledger, and Miss Marple glimpsed a page of figures, some hastily scratched out. She recalled whispers of discrepancies in the church funds, a topic that had sparked heated arguments between Poole and the vicar. "Differences can weigh heavily, Mr. Poole," she said, her tone mild. "Your ledger seems quite detailed. Did the vicar ever question it?" Poole's face reddened. "He trusted me implicitly. Those rumors of mismanagement are nonsense." But his fingers gripped the pen too tightly, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor. A clue, perhaps, hidden in the columns of numbers. At the village surgery, Dr. Amelia Croft was tending to a patient, her movements brisk and efficient. When Miss Marple arrived, the doctor ushered her into a tidy office, its shelves lined with medical journals and a faint scent of antiseptic. "A dreadful business," Dr. Croft said, her voice calm but her dark eyes watchful. "I confirmed it was cyanide, fast-acting, unmistakable. I prescribed digitalis for the vicar's heart condition, but this was no accident." Her composure, despite, well, a bit of trouble in my past. She noted a fresh scratch on his hand, red and jagged, as if from thorns, or something sharper. "Trouble, Tommy?" she asked gently. "The vicar was forgiving, I hear. But others, like Miss Finch, seemed upset with him." Tommy's eyes darted. "Miss Finch? She was mad about the organ funds. Argued with him last week, I heard. But me? I was just fixing lights at the hall." His words tumbled out too quickly, and Miss Marple tucked the observation away. Her final visit was to Miss Lydia Finch's cramped cottage, where the air smelled of lavender and old sheet music. The spinster organist, her gray hair pinned tightly, offered tea with trembling hands. "The vicar promised funds for the organ," she said, her voice quavering. "Then he changed his mind. I was upset. But poison? Heavens, no." Miss Marple's eyes strayed to a bottle on the shelf, labeled Garden Aid, but suspiciously like rat poison. Miss Finch followed her gaze and flushed. "For the mice, nothing more," she said quickly. As Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, the village settling into evening, she pieced together her observations. The teapot smudge, the sugar bowl's tilt, the scratched hand, the hidden poison. Each was a clue, but the pattern was incomplete. She recalled a similar case in her youth, a poisoned chalice at a church bazaar, where the truth lay in a single overlooked detail. The vicar's death was no accident, she was certain. But the killer's motive remained elusive. Back at her cottage, she poured a fresh cup of tea, the steam curling like her thoughts. The suspects: Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Poole, Dr. Croft, Tommy, Miss Finch. Each had a motive, however faint. Money, pride, resentment, or something deeper. Red herrings abounded. A torn note in the vicar's pocket reading, "Beware the warden," a misplaced sugar bowl that might mean nothing. But Miss Marple knew the truth was there, hidden in the everyday rhythms of St. Mary Mead. Waiting for cottage, with its rose-covered trellis and neat privet hedge, had been a haven for reflection that morning. But now she sought answers in the company of others. Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of observations, each thread a detail from the fateful evening. The shattered teacup, the faint bitter almond scent of cyanide, the smudged teapot handle, and the sugar bowl, slightly askew. These were no mere accidents, she knew, but deliberate acts woven into the fabric of village life. Her task was to find the pattern, The vicarage drawing room was a study in understated elegance, with chintz curtains framing tall windows and a mahogany table set with a silver tea service. The fire crackled in the grate, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of loss that hung over the room. Mrs. Hargrove, dressed in a somber black dress that seemed to accentuate her sharp features, poured tea with a trembling hand, though Miss Marple noted the precision of her movements. The lace handkerchief was gone, replaced by a silver locket at her throat, which she touched absently as she spoke. "Jane, dear," she said, her voice quavering with practiced grief. "I can scarcely believe Thomas is gone. Who could harbor such malice?" Miss Marple accepted a cup, her blue eyes gentle but piercing. "It is a terrible shock, Eliza. But tell me, you were so busy hosting last night. Did you notice anyone near the tea things before the meeting began?" Her tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather, but her question was a needle probing the fabric of memory. Eliza's hand paused, the teapot hovering. Well, I was arranging the cups, of course. Everyone was milling about, chatting. I didn't see anything unusual." Her eyes darted to the window, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her lips, a sign of unease. Village gossip had long hinted at financial strains in the Hargrove household, Eliza's taste for fine silks clashing with the vicar's modest stipend. Could money, Miss Marple wondered, have driven her to desperation? Sipping her tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the other committee member, blonde hair glinting in the sunlight. His roguish grin faltered as she approached, and he twisted his cap nervously. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a touch too loud. "Terrible about the vicar, ain't it?" "Terrible indeed, Tommy," she replied, her tone warm but probing. "You were at the hall late, fixing lights, you said. Did you see anyone near the tea table before the meeting?" Her eyes lingered on his hands, where the scratch was now covered by a bandage hastily applied. Tommy shifted, his boots scuffing the earth. "No, miss. I was up the ladder sorting bulbs, but, well, I heard Miss Finch arguing with the vicar a few days back. About the organ funds, I think. She was proper cross." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple noted the deflection, the way his eyes avoided hers. Was he hiding something, or merely eager to shift suspicion? "Miss Finch does take her music seriously," Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. "And you, Tommy? Any disagreements with the vicar?" She watched his reaction closely, noting the flush creeping up his neck. "Me? No, miss. He was kind, like I said. Gave me a chance." But his fingers twisted the cap tighter, and Miss Marple filed away the nervous gesture. As she turned to leave, she spotted a glint in the leaf pile. A small glass vial, empty and unlabeled, half buried in the dirt. She said nothing but marked its location in her mind, a potential clue masquerading as litter. Her next stop was Miss Lydia Finch's cottage, a tiny dwelling tucked behind the church, its garden overrun with lavender and hollyhocks. The air inside was thick with the scent of old sheet music and beeswax, and Miss Finch, her frail frame swathed in a gray cardigan, greeted Miss Marple with a nervous flutter. "Oh, Miss Marple, do come in," she said, her voice high and brittle. "Such a dreadful thing about poor Reverend Hargrove." Her hands trembled as she poured tea, the cup rattling against its saucer. They sat by a small table. Miss Finch's eyes widened, her hand jerking slightly. "Oh, yes, for the mice. They get into the pantry, you know." Her words were too quick, and Miss Marple smiled gently, letting the silence stretch. Miss Finch busied herself with the tea, her movements jerky, and Miss Marple added another thread to her mental tapestry. As she left the cottage, the village clock struck 4, its chimes echoing over the green. Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. Mr. Reginald Poole's ledger, glimpsed that morning, had shown discrepancies, small sums perhaps, but enough to spark the vicar's suspicion. Dr. Amelia Croft's calm demeanor hid a professional grudge, her plans for a modern clinic thwarted by the vicar's traditionalism. And Mrs. Hargrove, with her steady hands and financial woes, stood to inherit the vicar's modest estate. Each had a motive, however faint. But the clues were scattered, like leaves in Tommy's pile. Miss Marple paused by the village green, where children played near the duck pond, their laughter a stark contrast to the somber mood. She recalled a similar case from her youth, a poisoned chalice at a church bazaar, where the killer had used a sleight of hand to tamper with a single glass. The teapot at the hall, she mused, was the key. Only the vicar's cup had been poisoned, suggesting intimate knowledge of his habits. But who had the opportunity? Mrs. Hargrove had poured the tea, but others had been near the table. Tommy fixing lights, Miss Finch arranging hymnals, Dr. Croft chatting nearby, Mr. Poole pacing with his ledger. A red herring emerged in her thoughts. The torn note in the vicar's pocket reading, "Beware the warden." It pointed too neatly to Mr. Poole, almost as if planted to mislead. And the sugar bowl, askew but untouched by others. Had it been tampered with, or was it a distraction? Miss Marple's instincts hummed, warning her against the obvious. Human nature, she knew, was rarely so straightforward. Following the vicar's poisoning at Redwick Parish Hall settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy fog, dampening the village's usual cheer. The autumn sun struggled through clouds, casting a muted glow over the thatched roofs and winding lanes, where villagers moved with hushed steps and wary glances. The scent of wood smoke and wet leaves hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of late-blooming roses. Gossip, once a lively current, had turned cautious, as if each whispered theory might summon the killer from the shadows. Miss Jane Marple, however, walked through this subdued world with her usual quiet purpose, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, and her knitting bag a constant companion. Her mind, sharp as her needles, wove together the threads of the mystery. The shattered teacup, the smudged teapot handle, the vial in the churchyard, and the torn note reading, "Beware the warden." Miss Marple's cottage, with its neat garden and cozy sitting room, was her sanctuary for reflection, but the village itself held the clues she sought. She recalled a case from her youth, a poisoned chalice at a church bazaar in Littlehampton, where the truth had lain in a single, overlooked detail, a smudged fingerprint on a glass. The vicar's death, she was certain, followed a similar pattern, its answer hidden in the everyday rhythms of St. Mary Mead. This morning, she resolved to revisit Redwick Parish Hall, where the tragedy had unfolded, to seek out the subtle traces the killer had left behind. The hall stood somber under the gray sky, its stone walls cool to the touch, and its windows dark, save for the faint glow of a constable's lantern inside. Inspector Craddock, his mustache bristling with determination, was interviewing a villager in the makeshift office, his voice carrying through the open door. Miss Marple slipped inside, her footsteps soft on the stone floor, and paused by the oak table where the fatal tea had been served. The room smelled of dust and old polish, the fire long extinguished, leaving a chill that seemed to echo the village's mood. The teapot, smudge on the teapot handle, left-handed perhaps, and the note in the vicar's pocket, "Beware the warden." It feels staged, don't you think? She left the thought hanging, knowing Craddock would mull it over. As she stepped back, her gaze fell on a corner of the table where a faint scratch marked the wood, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. A tray, perhaps, or a misplaced cup. She filed the detail away, another thread in her tapestry. Her next stop was the village tea shop, a cozy haven where lace curtains framed steamed-up windows and the aroma of fresh scones enveloped her. The shop was abuzz with villagers, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple settled at a corner table, her knitting needles clicking as she listened. Mrs. Pemberley, the postmistress, was holding court, her round face flushed with indignation. "I heard Dr. Croft arguing with the vicar last week," she said, leaning forward. "Outside the surgery, no less. 'You meddle too much, doctor,' he shouted, something about her modern ways clashing with his sermons." The other women nodded, their teacups clinking, and Miss Marple noted the tidbit. A professional disagreement could fester, she knew, especially for someone as poised and proud as Dr. Amelia Croft. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple made her way to Dr. Croft's surgery, a neat brick building with a sign reading Dr. A. Croft, physician. The waiting room was empty, save for a vase of chrysanthemums and a stack of medical journals. Dr. Croft, in a crisp white coat, greeted her with a polite smile, though her dark eyes were guarded. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I suppose you're here about the vicar. Dreadful business." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her needles resuming their rhythm. "You were quick to identify the cyanide, doctor, a remarkable skill. Did you notice anything unusual at the meeting? Someone lingering near the tea table, perhaps?" Dr. Croft's fingers tightened on a pen, her composure unwavering but her eyes narrowing slightly. "I was discussing the fate with Mr. Pooh." Shelf, stained with a dark smudge. Ink or something else? The question lingered. Next, Miss Marple visited Mr. Reginald Poole at the church, where he was tallying collection plates in the vestry. The room was dim, lit by a single lamp, and the air smelled of wax and old hymnals. Poole's gaunt face was etched with worry, his ledger open before him. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "this tragedy has disrupted everything. The fete must go on, but the police are hounding me." "You and the vicar disagreed about funds," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "It must have been trying, with the church roof so urgent." Poole's eyes flickered to his ledger, where a page showed scratched-out figures. "He accused me of mismanagement, but it was a misunderstanding. I'd lose everything if those rumors spread." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the desperation. Embezzlement was a strong motive, but too obvious, she thought. The note in the vicar's pocket, "Beware the warden," felt like a deliberate misdirection. Too neat to be true. As she left the church, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village's past. St. Mary Mead, for all its charm, had its shadows. Wartime secrets, old grudges, whispered scandals. She recalled a story from the war years. A local man, dismissed as a deserter, had been shunned by the church, his family left in disgrace. Could such a grudge resurface? The thought was fleeting, but she tucked it away, like a spare skein of wool. Her final stop was the village green, where a group of children played near the duck pond, their laughter a fleeting reprieve from the tension. There, she overheard a snippet of gossip. A stranger had been seen near the parish hall the night of the murder. A man in a dark coat, slipping into the shadows. A red herring, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss it outright. She paused by the churchyard, where Tommy Baxter had been raking leaves the previous day. The vial she'd spotted was gone, likely collected by the police. Bowl, she mused, was the key. Only the vicar used it, and the poison had been precise. Someone had tampered with it, knowing his habits intimately. But who had the opportunity and the nerve to act in a room full of witnesses? As the village clock struck 6, its chimes echoing through the dusk, Miss Marple's mind turned to human nature. In her long life, she had seen greed, pride, and resentment drive people to desperate acts, often cloaked in the mundane. The killer, she sensed, was someone who blended into St. Mary Mead's rhythm, their malice hidden in plain sight. She sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing. The mystery was deepening, but the truth, she knew, was there, waiting in the quiet corners of the village, ready to be unraveled. Chapter 5. Garden Secrets. The 5th day since the poisoning at Redwick Parish Hall dawned crisp and clear in St. Mary Mead, the autumn sun casting a golden sheen over the village's thatched cottages and winding lanes. The air was rich with the scent of damp earth, fallen leaves, and the faint sweetness of late-blooming honeysuckle. Yet, beneath this idyllic surface, tension simmered like a kettle left too long on the hob. Villagers moved with cautious steps, their conversations hushed, as if the shadow of Reverend Thomas Hargrove's murder lingered in every corner. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting bag tucked under her arm, walked through the village with her usual quiet purpose, her mind a whirl of observations. The smudged teapot handle, the torn note reading, "Beware the warden," the vial in the churchyard, and the askew sugar bowl. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the mystery, and she was determined to weave them together. Miss Marple's morning began in her cottage, where the fire crackled in the grate and the scent of brewing tea filled her cozy sitting room. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she reviewed the clues. The cyanide, precise and deadly, had been meant for the vicar alone, slipped into his tea via the sugar he always used. The killer, she mused, knew his habits intimately, a fact that pointed to someone close, someone at the parish hall meeting. Her thoughts turned to the suspects. Mrs. Eliza Hargrove, with her financial strains and steady hands. Mr. Reginald Poole, whose ledger hid discrepancies. Dr. Amelia Croft, her professional pride bruised by the vicar's traditionalism. Young Tommy Baxter, with his nervous deflection and scratched hand. And Miss Lydia Finch, her trembling fingers and suspicious garden aid. Each had a motive, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the everyday rhythms of St. Mary Mead. Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple set out for the vicarage garden, a sprawling patch of roses and lavender that bordered the churchyard. The garden was tended by Tommy Baxter, under the supervision of the head gardener, a thorn's jagged tear. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, but her smile remained gentle. "You were at the hall late, fixing lights," she said, her tone conversational. "Did you see Mrs. Hargrove near the tea table? I hear she and the vicar had words about money." Her question was a gentle probe designed to elicit more than Tommy might intend. He shifted, his boots scuffing the earth. "Mrs. Hargrove? Aye. I heard him arguing a week back. She wanted new curtains for the vicarage, but he said the church roof came first. She inherits it all now, don't she?" His words were quick, almost too eager, and Miss Marple noted the deflection. Was Tommy pointing fingers to avoid scrutiny, or had he genuinely overheard something damning? "Money does complicate things," she said, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "And that vial I saw in the churchyard, near the compost heap. Any idea what it was?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching his reaction. Tommy's face paled, his fingers tightening on the shears. "Vial? Dunno, miss. Gardeners use all sorts. Fertilizer, pest killer. Could have been anything." His voice was too quick, and Miss Marple filed away the unease. As she bent to admire a rose, her keen eyes scanned the compost heap where the vial had been. The earth was disturbed, as if someone had searched it recently. A clue, perhaps? Or another red herring? Leaving Tommy to his pruning, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where the organ's mournful notes drifted through the open door. Miss Lydia Finch was practicing, her frail figure hunched over the keys, her gray cardigan blending with the dim interior. The organ wheezed, its pipes in desperate need of repair, and Miss Marple recalled Lydia's agitation over the funds the vicar had denied. She slipped into a pew, her knitting resuming as she listened to the halting melody. When the music paused, she called softly, "Lydia, dear, such a lovely tune. The organ does struggle, though, doesn't it?" Miss Finch turned, her face flushed with exertion or emotion. "Paper. A list of numbers, like a code or a tally. Could it be related to the vicar's death, or was it merely Miss Finch's accounting for her music lessons?" Miss Marple's next stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Pemberley, the postmistress, was sorting letters behind the counter. The shop smelled of soap and fresh bread, and a small crowd of villagers lingered, their voices low with speculation. Miss Marple purchased a skein of wool, her ears attuned to the gossip. "I heard Mr. Poole was furious with the vicar," said Mrs. Carter, the baker's wife, her hands flour-dusted. "Something about missing funds. And that Dr. Croft, she was seen near the hall late, you know." The whispers swirled, and Miss Marple tucked them away, noting the red herrings. A stranger in a dark coat. A rumor of wartime grudges resurfacing. Back at Redwick Parish Hall, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock examining the table where the tea had been served. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone warmer now, "the sugar tested positive for cyanide traces. You were right. It was targeted. But who had access?" His frustration was palpable, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the smudged teapot handle, possibly left-handed. Miss Finch was left-handed, she recalled. But so was Tommy, a detail she'd noticed when he held his shears. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "have you checked the vicar's desk? He was a meticulous man. Perhaps he left a clue." Craddock nodded, and they moved to the small office adjoining the hall, where the vicar's desk stood cluttered with papers. Among them was a letter, half-written, addressed to the bishop. "Reginald's accounts are troubling," it read, "but I fear worse secrets lurk." The note was unsigned, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Was it a genuine clue, or another planted distraction? As she left the hall, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Dr. Croft. The doctor's alibi, tending patients, was solid, but her stained gloves and professional grudge lingered in Miss Marple's mind. She recalled a chemical scent, not cyanide, but something sharp, like ink or antiseptic. Could it lights? Miss Finch with her hymnals. Dr. Croft in conversation. Mr. Poole pacing. A memory surfaced, a case in her youth where a poisoned cake had been traced to a family secret, hidden in plain sight. The vicar's death, she realized, was personal, driven by a motive deeper than money or pride. The note, the vial, the smudged handle, all were threads, but the pattern was incomplete. As the village clock struck 7, its chimes echoing through the dusk, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing. The truth was there, in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, waiting for her to unravel its secrets. Chapter 6. False Trails. The 6th day since the poisoning of Reverend Thomas Hargrove at Redwick Parish Hall brought a restless energy to St. Mary Mead. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp moss and chimney smoke, while the village's cobbled lanes bustled with cautious whispers. The sun, low and pale, cast long shadows across the thatched cottages, as if mirroring the lengthening doubts that plagued the community. The vicar's murder had fractured the village's cozy rhythm, and suspicion now clung to every glance and greeting. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting bag swinging gently, moved through this uneasy world with her characteristic quiet resolve. Her mind was a tapestry of clues: the smudged teapot handle, the cyanide-laced sugar, the vial in the churchyard, the torn note reading, "Beware the warden," each a thread waiting to be woven into truth. Miss Marple's cottage, with its rose-covered trellis and warm sitting room, had been her haven for reflection. But the village itself held the answers she sought. She sipped her morning tea, the steam curling like her thoughts, and reviewed the suspects. Mrs. Eliza Hargrove, whose financial strains and steady hands hinted at hidden motives. Mr. Reginald Poole, his ledger marred by discrepancies. Dr. Amelia Croft, her professional pride stung by the vicar. To test this lead, Miss Marple made her way to Redwick Parish Hall, where Inspector Craddock was overseeing the investigation. The hall's stone walls loomed somberly, its windows dark, as if guarding its secrets. Inside, the oak table bore the faint chalk outline of the teapot, a reminder of the fatal night. Craddock, his mustache twitching with frustration, was questioning a constable about the footprint. "Found near the back door," the constable said, holding up a plaster cast. "Size matches Baxter's boots, sir." Miss Marple, slipping into the room unnoticed, cleared her throat softly. "Inspector, a footprint is telling, but context matters. Tommy was fixing lights, wasn't he? His presence at the hall is hardly surprising." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, noting Craddock's nod. "True enough, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his chin. "But we brought him in for questioning. He's sticking to his story. Lights, not poison. Any thoughts?" She hesitated, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "The sugar bowl, Inspector. Only the vicar used it. Someone tampered with it before the meeting, when the hall was busy." "Have you checked Mrs. Hargrove's movements? She poured the tea, but her alibi is thin." Her words were a gentle nudge, and Craddock's eyes narrowed, considering. Leaving the hall, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where Mrs. Hargrove was sorting condolence cards in the drawing room. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the chintz curtains. But Eliza's face was pale, her black dress accentuating her sharp features. "Jane, it's unbearable," she said, her voice quavering. "The police keep asking questions, as if I could harm Thomas." Her hands, Miss Marple noted, were steady as she arranged the cards, belying her tears. "Such a trial, Eliza," Miss Marple said, settling into an armchair. "You were so busy hosting that night. Did you leave the tea table at all, even for a moment?" Her tone was sympathetic. "Before the meeting. Near the back door, perhaps." Her question was casual, but Dr. Croft's pen stilled, her composure faltering for a moment. "I was checking on Mrs. Carter's sprained ankle nearby," she said, her voice steady but her eyes narrowing. "I never entered the hall until the meeting." Her alibi held, but Miss Marple noted the faint chemical scent on her gloves glimpsed earlier. Not cyanide, but something sharp. Ink, perhaps, or a medical compound. A clue, or another distraction? At the church, Miss Marple found Miss Lydia Finch practicing the organ, its wheezing notes echoing through the stone arches. The spinster's gray cardigan hung loosely on her frail frame, and her hands trembled as she played. "Miss Marple," she said, pausing, "this organ is a disgrace. The vicar promised funds, then betrayed me. But I'd never harm him." Her voice was shrill, and Miss Marple recalled the garden aid bottle, now missing from her cottage shelf. Had the police taken it? Or had Lydia hidden it? "Lydia, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "That garden aid you mentioned, for mice, you said. Has it been misplaced?" Her eyes were gentle, but Miss Finch's face flushed, her fingers clutching the organ keys. I threw it out. It was old, useless," she stammered. And Miss Marple noted the lie, subtle but clear. The vial in the churchyard, she suspected, was linked to that bottle, its contents possibly diluted to mimic cyanide. As evening fell, the village gathered for the vicar's funeral at St. Mary's Church, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and wax. The pews were filled, villagers in somber black, their faces a mix of grief and suspicion. Mrs. Hargrove wept softly. Mr. Poole sat rigidly. Dr. Croft's expression was unreadable. Tommy fidgeted, and Miss Finch's hands trembled as she played a halting hymn. Miss Marple, seated at the back, observed their interactions, Eliza's hand brushing Dr. Croft's arm. A whispered exchange between Poole and a church elder. Tommy's nervous glance toward the door, tempered with it during the pre-meeting bustle, when eyes were distracted. But who had the nerve? She poured a cup of tea, the steam curling like her thoughts. A memory surfaced, a case from her youth, where a poisoned letter had been traced to a jealous sibling, the motive hidden in a family secret. The vicar's death, she mused, was personal, driven by a grudge deeper than money or pride. The torn note, "Beware the warden," was too deliberate, likely planted to implicate Poole. The vial, the smudged handle, the coded list in Miss Finch's hymn book all pointed to different suspects, but none formed a complete picture. As the village clock struck 8, its chimes echoing through the dusk, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The killer was someone who blended into St. Mary Mead's rhythm, their malice cloaked in the mundane. The funeral had revealed tensions, alliances shifting, glances exchanged, but the truth remained just out of reach. She sipped her tea, her mind threading the needle through the fabric of human nature, searching for the pattern that would unravel the mystery of Redwick Parish Hall. Chapter 7. Turning Points. The 7th day since the poisoning of Reverend Thomas Hargrove at Redwick Parish Hall brought a subtle shift to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself sensed a turning point in the unraveling mystery. The autumn air was sharp, laced with the scent of damp leaves and the faint smokiness of chimneys, while the sun cast a hesitant glow over the thatched cottages and cobbled lanes. The initial shock of the vicar's death had settled into a quiet unease, with villagers exchanging guarded glances and hushed theories. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting bag at her side, moved through this subdued world with her characteristic calm, her mind weaving together the clues that had emerged: the cyanide-laced sugar, the smudged teapot handle, the vial in the churchyard, the torn note reading, "Beware the warden," and the coded list in Miss Finch's hymn book. Her first stop was the vicarage, where a weekly bridge game offered a chance to observe the suspects in a relaxed setting. The drawing room was warm, the fire casting flickering shadows over the chintz curtains and mahogany table, where Mrs. Hargrove, Dr. Croft, and 2 other villagers sat with cards in hand. Miss Marple joined them, her knitting needles clicking as she played her cards with deceptive mildness. Mrs. Hargrove, dressed in somber black, dealt with a practiced smile, but her eyes were weary. "Jane, dear," she said, her voice quavering, "this game is a welcome distraction. The police are relentless." "Such a trial, Eliza," Miss Marple replied, her tone sympathetic. "You mentioned fetching biscuits during the meeting. The kitchen clock at the hall. Was it running slow?" Her question was casual, but her eyes caught Eliza's hesitation, the way her fingers tightened on the cards. "Oh, I suppose it was," Eliza said, her voice too bright. "Thomas always took his tea black, but that night he asked for sugar. Odd, now I think of it." The slip was subtle, but Miss Marple pounced, mentally. The vicar's habit was well known: black tea, 1 spoonful of sugar. If he'd asked for sugar unexpectedly, it was a lie, or someone had ensured he used it. As the game progressed, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Tommy Baxter. "Young Tommy seems troubled," she said, watching Dr. Croft's reaction. The doctor, her dark hair pinned neatly, played a card with precision. "He's a nervous boy," she said, her voice calm, "but harmless. I treated that scratch on his hand. Thorns, he said." Her tone was neutral, but Miss Marple noted the glance she exchanged with Eliza. A fleeting moment of complicity, or mere politeness. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, where Tommy was sweeping leaves, his blonde hair tousled by the breeze. His roguish grin faltered as she approached. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "Police been asking about that footprint. I told him I was fixing lights, nothing more. Offered tea with trembling hands." "Miss Marple," she said, her voice brittle, "the police took my garden aid bottle. They think it's poison, but it was for mice." Her eyes were wide, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the bottle, replaced by a vase of wilted roses. "Lydia, dear," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking, "I found a list in your hymn book, numbers like a tally. Was it for the organ fund?" Her question was gentle, but Miss Finch's hands jerked, spilling tea. Just my music lessons," she stammered, but her eyes avoided Miss Marple's. The list, Miss Marple suspected, was more than it seemed, perhaps a code or a record of something incriminating. As she left, she noted a faint chemical scent in the air, not unlike the one on Dr. Croft's gloves. A coincidence or a connection? At Redwick Parish Hall, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock examining the vicar's desk, where the half-written letter to the bishop, "Reginald's accounts are troubling," lay among papers. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone warmer now. "We've cleared Poole. His ledger was messy, but the vicar forgave him. An alibi witness confirms he was walking that night." The news was a breakthrough, narrowing the suspects, but Miss Marple's mind turned to the note, "Beware the warden." Too deliberate, she thought. A red herring to implicate Poole. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "the sugar bowl is key. Someone tampered with it during the bustle before the meeting. Have you checked the teapot's handle for prints?" Craddock nodded, revealing that the smudge was indeed left-handed, a detail that pointed to Miss Finch or Tommy. But Tommy's confession had cleared him, leaving Miss Finch's trembling hands and missing bottle in sharper focus. As evening fell, Miss Marple attended a village meeting to plan the vicar's memorial fete, held in the church hall. The room was crowded, the air thick with the scent of tea and tension. Mrs. Hargrove, Dr. Croft, Miss Finch, and other villagers sat around the oak table, their faces a mix of grief and suspicion. Miss Marple's metronome. The clues were aligning. The left-handed smudge, the vial linked to Miss Finch's bottle, the journal's cryptic entry. Mrs. Hargrove's inheritance remained a strong motive, but her grief seemed genuine. Dr. Croft's alibi held, but her stained gloves nagged at Miss Marple's mind. Ink, not cyanide, but a sign of something hidden. Poole was cleared, and Tommy's theft was minor. Miss Finch, with her coded list and missing poison, loomed larger, but the L could point elsewhere. A memory surfaced, a case from her youth where a poisoned letter had been traced to a spurned friend, the motive buried in a long-forgotten slight. The vicar's death, she mused, was driven by a personal betrayal, cloaked in the mundane. The sugar bowl, tampered with in plain sight, required boldness and familiarity. Miss Finch's trembling hands, her obsession with the organ, her left-handed grip, each was a thread, but the pattern was not yet complete. As the village clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the dusk, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing. The memorial fete loomed, a chance for the killer to act again or slip. The truth, she knew, was hidden in St. Mary Mead's quiet corners, waiting for her to unravel its secrets. The turning points were clear. Suspects narrowed, clues sharpened, but the final thread remained just out of reach, buried in the everyday acts of a village on edge. Chapter 8. The Net Tightens. The 8th day since the poisoning of Reverend Thomas Hargrove at Redwick Parish Hall dawned with a brisk clarity over St. Mary Mead, the autumn sun piercing the morning mist to gild the village's thatched cottages and winding lanes. The air was sharp with the scent of frost-kissed leaves and the faint smokiness of early fires. But an undercurrent of tension pulsed beneath the village's tranquil surface. The vicar's murder had woven a web of suspicion, and the villagers moved with cautious steps, their whispers laden with doubt. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting bag at her side, walked through this uneasy world with quiet resolve. Loomed as a strong motive, but her grief seemed genuine. Dr. Amelia Croft's professional grudge and stained gloves raised questions, but her alibi held. Miss Lydia Finch, with her trembling hands, missing garden aid bottle, and left-handed grip, was increasingly central. Yet the journal's L could also point to Eliza, whose middle name was Louise. The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the mundane details of village life, and today she aimed to unravel them. Her first stop was the vicarage where Mrs. Hargrove was arranging flowers for the upcoming memorial fete. The drawing room was bright, with sunlight streaming through the chintz curtains. But Eliza's face was pale, her black dress accentuating her sharp features. "Jane, dear," she said, her voice strained. "This fete feels wrong without Thomas, but we must honor him." Her hands, arranging roses with precision, betrayed no tremor, and Miss Marple noted the contrast with her tearful demeanor. "Eliza," Miss Marple said, settling into an armchair, her needles clicking. "You mentioned the vicar asking for sugar that night. Unusual, wasn't it? Did anyone else handle the sugar bowl before you poured the tea?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching Eliza's reaction. Eliza's fingers paused on a rose stem. I don't recall. Everyone was milling about. I filled the teapot and set out the cups, but I was distracted." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease. The kitchen clock, off by 10 minutes, suggested Eliza's brief absence could have allowed tampering, but her steady hands hinted at control, not panic. Was she hiding something, or merely overwhelmed? Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked to the church where Miss Lydia Finch was practicing the organ, its wheezing notes echoing through the stone arches. The spinster's gray cardigan hung loosely on her frail frame, and her hands trembled as she played. "Miss Marple," she said, pausing, "the police keep asking about my garden aid. Patient records, her movements precise." "Miss Marple," she said, her dark eyes guarded, "the police are circling, but I was at my surgery all evening. My patients confirm it." Her tone was calm, but Miss Marple recalled the stained gloves now tucked away on a shelf. "Dr. Croft," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "Your gloves had a chemical scent, not cyanide, but sharp. Ink, perhaps, or something medical?" Her question was gentle, but the doctor's hand stilled, her composure faltering for a moment. "Ink, yes," Dr. Croft said quickly. "I was labeling bottles that day. Nothing more." Her alibi held, but Miss Marple noted the slight flush on her cheeks. The vicar's opposition to her clinic plans was a motive, but the gloves suggested she'd handled something incriminating, perhaps the vial, or a forged note. At Redwick Parish Hall, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock examining the vicar's journal, its cryptic entry, "L knows my decision on the funds," open on the desk. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone warmer now, "we've confirmed the vial in the churchyard matches rat poison, like Miss Finch's bottle. And the teapot handle, left-handed prints, clear as day." The evidence pointed to Miss Finch, but Miss Marple's instincts warned against the obvious. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "the note, 'Beware the warden,' feels staged. And the journal's L, it could be Lydia, but Eliza's middle name is Louise. Have you checked her movements?" Craddock nodded, revealing that Eliza had admitted to a longer absence in the kitchen, claiming she'd spilled tea and needed to clean up. The discrepancy in the clock, Miss Marple thought, could cover a deliberate act. As evening approached, Miss Marple attended a village meeting to finalize the fete plans, held in the church hall. The room was crowded, the air thick with the scent of tea and tension. Mrs. Hargrove, Dr. Croft, Miss Finch, and other villagers sat around the oak table, their faces a mix of determination and unease. Miss Marple, seated in a corner, observed their interactions. Lingering question. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. The net was tightening. The left-handed smudge, the vial linked to Miss Finch's rat poison, the journal's L, the sugar packet. Eliza's inheritance was a motive, but her steady hands and grief suggested complexity. Dr. Croft's gloves were stained with ink, not cyanide, but her professional grudge lingered. Miss Finch's coded list and missing bottle were damning, but the L could point to Eliza. The sugar packet, Miss Marple realized, was the key. Someone had swapped it during the bustle, knowing the vicar's habits. A memory surfaced, a case from her youth, where a poisoned sweet had been traced to a spurned lover, the motive buried in a forgotten slight. The vicar's death, she mused, was driven by a personal betrayal, cloaked in the mundane. The sugar packet required intimacy and opportunity, pointing to someone at the heart of the meeting. Miss Finch's trembling hands and left-handed grip were compelling, but Eliza's absence and the journal's ambiguity kept her in focus. As the village clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the night, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing. The fete loomed, a chance for the killer to slip or act again. The clues were aligning, the suspects dwindling, but the final thread remained elusive. The truth, she knew, was hidden in St. Mary Mead's quiet corners, waiting for her to unravel its secrets with one final tug. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The 9th day since the poisoning of Reverend Thomas Hargrove at Redwick Parish Hall brought a hushed anticipation to St. Mary Mead. The autumn air was crisp, scented with wood smoke and the faint sweetness of fading roses as the village prepared for the memorial fete. The sun cast a pale glow over the thatched cottages and cobbled lanes, but beneath the serene surface, tension crackled like embers in a hearth. The vicar's murder had woven a web of suspicion, and the villagers, Croft, her stained gloves and professional grudge under scrutiny, and Miss Lydia Finch, whose trembling hands, left-handed grip, and missing garden aid bottle pointed to guilt. Mr. Reginald Poole and Tommy Baxter had been cleared, Poole's ledger discrepancies forgiven, Tommy's theft minor. But the L in the vicar's journal could mean Lydia, or Eliza Louise. The sugar packet found in the hall's waste bin, laced with cyanide, was the key, requiring intimate knowledge and bold execution. Miss Marple knew the killer had exploited the bustle of the meeting, and tonight's fete offered the perfect stage for a revelation. Redwick Parish Hall was transformed for the fete, its stone walls adorned with garlands of ivy and chrysanthemums, its windows aglow with lamplight. The oak table, once the scene of tragedy, now held platters of scones, jams, and a gleaming tea service, carefully inspected by Inspector Craddock's team. Villagers milled about, their voices a low hum of forced cheer, while children darted through the crowd, clutching paper flags. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed the suspects. Eliza, in somber black, arranging flowers with a strained smile. Dr. Croft, poised in a green dress, chatting with villagers. And Miss Finch, her gray cardigan blending into the shadows as she adjusted hymnals near the organ. As the fete began, Miss Marple slipped into the vicar's office, where Craddock was reviewing notes. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I believe the killer is here tonight. The sugar packet, the left-handed smudge, the vial, all point to someone close to the vicar. May I gather the committee members? A few questions might clarify things." Craddock, now accustomed to her insight, nodded, his mustache twitching with curiosity. Miss Marple arranged for the suspects to meet in the hall's small library, a quiet room lined with dusty books and a single lamp casting a warm glow. Eliza, Dr. Croft, and Miss Finch sat around a mahogany table, their faces a mix of apprehension and confusion. Tommy Baxter was gentle, but Eliza's face flushed, her hands clutching her locket. "Jane, how could you?" Eliza cried. "I loved Thomas. Yes, we argued about money, but I'd never harm him." Her tears seemed genuine, and Miss Marple noted the steadiness of her hands, suggesting control rather than guilt. Next, she addressed Dr. Croft. "Doctor, your gloves bore a chemical scent. Ink, you said. But could it be something else? The vicar opposed your clinic plans, a blow to your pride." Dr. Croft's dark eyes narrowed, but her voice remained steady. "My gloves were stained from labeling bottles," she said. "My alibi is solid, patience all evening. I had no reason to kill him." Her composure held, and Miss Marple recalled the ink, not cyanide, confirming her words but leaving the grudge unresolved. Finally, she turned to Miss Finch, whose hands shook violently, her teacup rattling. "Lydia, dear, your garden aid bottle, rat poison, likely the source of the vial in the churchyard. You're left-handed, like the smudge on the teapot, and the vicar's journal mentioned L. You, perhaps, furious over the organ funds?" Her voice was kind, but the accusation was clear. Miss Finch's face crumpled, her voice a wail. "I was upset, yes. The organ is my life, and he betrayed me for Eliza's extravagance. But I only meant to scare him." The room froze, the confession hanging like a thunderclap. Craddock stepped forward, his notebook forgotten. As Miss Finch continued, her words tumbling out. "I put a tiny amount of rat poison in the sugar, thinking it would make him ill, not kill him. I didn't know it was cyanide strength." Her sobs filled the room, and Miss Marple's eyes softened with pity. "Lydia," she said gently, "you knew his habits. Black tea, 1 spoonful. You swapped the sugar packet during the bustle, using your left hand to pour. The note, 'Beware the warden,' was your forgery, meant to point to Mr. Poole. And the list in your hymn book, dates and doses, wasn't it?" Miss Finch left-handed smudge. The vial matching the rat poison. The coded list. The forged note. Eliza's inheritance and Dr. Croft's grudge were red herrings, their motives real, but not lethal. Miss Finch's act, born of desperation over her beloved organ, had spiraled into tragedy, a classic tale of human frailty. Craddock returned, his face a mix of admiration and relief. "Miss Marple, you've done it again. How did you know?" She smiled, her needles clicking. "Human nature, Inspector. It's always the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or London. Lydia's obsession with her organ, her quiet resentment. It was there in her trembling hands, her coded lists. The sugar packet was her boldest move, hidden in plain sight." Her voice was soft, but her eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. As the fete continued outside, Miss Marple slipped away, her shawl drawn close against the evening chill. The village clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the dusk, and she walked home, her mind at peace. The mystery was solved, the killer unmasked, but the truth, as always, had been woven into the everyday. A teaspoon of sugar, a trembling hand, a heart's hidden wound. St. Mary Mead would heal, she knew, its rhythm restored. But Miss Marple's work was never truly done, for human nature was an endless tapestry, waiting for her to unravel its next thread. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Reflections. The 10th day since the tragic poisoning of Reverend Thomas Hargrove at Redwick Parish Hall dawned with a gentle calm over St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself exhaled in relief after the storm of suspicion. The autumn sun filtered through a delicate mist, casting a soft glow over the thatched cottages and winding lanes, where the scent of damp leaves mingled with the faint sweetness of late-blooming honeysuckle. The memorial fete had concluded the previous night, its garlands of ivy and chrysanthemums still adorning the parish hall, a bittersweet reminder of the community's resilience. The revelation of Miss Lydia contrast to the tension of the past week. Outside, the village clock chimed 10, its notes echoing through the morning, signaling a return to the familiar rhythms of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple poured the tea with practiced grace, her blue eyes gentle behind her spectacles, but sharp with insight. "Inspector, Eliza," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "Please do sit. A cup of tea can work wonders after such a trying time." Her guests settled into chairs, Craddock with his notebook tucked away. Eliza with her black dress softened by a pearl brooch, her hands no longer clutching a handkerchief but resting calmly in her lap. "Miss Marple," Craddock began, his mustache twitching with curiosity, "you've unraveled this mystery with remarkable clarity. But I'd be grateful if you'd walk us through it. How did you know it was Miss Finch?" His tone was earnest, and Eliza nodded, her eyes wide with anticipation. Miss Marple smiled, handing them each a cup. "Human nature, Inspector, is like my knitting. A pattern emerges from simple stitches if you know where to look. The vicar's death was no accident, but a deliberate act cloaked in the mundane. Let us start at the beginning." She sipped her tea, her words measured, as if threading a needle through the fabric of the case. "The poison was cyanide slipped into the sugar bowl, which only the vicar used. Black tea, 1 spoonful, a habit everyone at the meeting knew. The killer required opportunity and boldness, acting in the bustle before the parish hall meeting. The teapot handle bore a left-handed smudge, a subtle clue, and the sugar packet found in the waste bin confirmed the poison's delivery. These pointed to someone familiar, someone trusted." Her eyes flickered to Eliza, who stirred uneasily, then back to Craddock, who leaned forward. "Mrs. Hargrove," Miss Marple continued, "you poured the tea, and your absence in the kitchen covered by a slew of questions. But his confession of petty theft was minor, and his scratch matched the rose thorns in the garden. He was no killer." Her voice was calm, weaving the threads together with clarity. "That left Miss Finch," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Lydia, poor soul, was consumed by her love for the church organ, a passion the vicar thwarted by prioritizing the roof. Her trembling hands, her left-handed grip, the missing garden aid bottle. Rat poison, likely the source of the churchyard vial, were telling. The coded list in her hymn book, a tally of doses or dates, betrayed her planning. And the journal's L, I realized, was Lydia, not Louise, as Eliza's middle name might suggest. She paused, sipping her tea, letting the weight of the revelation settle. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. Lydia? She seemed so harmless, so devoted to her music. How could she? Miss Marple's expression softened. Human frailty, my dear. Lydia didn't intend murder, only to scare the vicar, make him ill, force him to reconsider the organ funds. She diluted the rack poison, believing it safe, but its potency mimicked cyanide. Her confession last night confirmed it. She swapped the sugar packet during the pre-meeting bustle, using her left hand to pour, leaving the smudge. The note, "Beware the warden," was her forgery. A desperate attempt to shift blame. Her resentment, quiet but deep, drove her to a tragic mistake. Craddock rubbed his chin. The vial in the churchyard, rat poison confirmed by the lab, and the left-handed print was conclusive. But how did you see through the red herrings? Miss Marple's smile was wry. Red herrings, Inspector, are like dropped stitches, distracting, but they unravel with care. The note was too obvious. The footprint near the hall too convenient for Tommy's presence. The stranger in the dark coat, whispered about in the tea shop. Marple, I'd have chased that note and footprint for weeks. What's next for you? Another mystery? She chuckled softly, her needles clicking. Oh, Inspector, mysteries find me, not the other way round. For now, I'll tend my roses and finish this shawl. But human nature, you know, is never still. There's always another pattern to unravel. Her eyes twinkled and Craddock grinned, shaking his head. Eliza rose, her face softer now. Jane, thank you. For Thomas, for the village. I don't know how we'd manage without you. She clasped Miss Marple's hand, and the elderly spinster squeezed it gently, her warmth a balm to the widow's grief. As her guests departed, Miss Marple settled by the window, the morning sun streaming through the lace curtains. Outside, St. Mary Mead stirred, children played on the green, the postmistress chatted with villagers, the church bell rang for morning service. The mystery of Redwick Parish Hall was solved, its threads woven into a coherent pattern. A teaspoon of sugar, a left-handed smudge, a coded list, a heart's quiet resentment. Miss Finch's act, though tragic, was a reminder of the fragility beneath the village's cozy facade. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. A memory surfaced, a case from her youth where a poisoned cake had revealed a family secret, the truth hidden in a single crumb. The vicar's death, she mused, was no different. Its answer buried in the everyday. The village would move forward, its wounds healing like the roses in her garden. But Miss Marple knew her work was never truly done. Human nature, with its endless complexities, would always offer another puzzle, another thread to unravel in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. As the clock chimed 11, its notes drifting through the village, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind already turning to the next pattern, the next truth waiting to be discovered. For now, though, she was content, her tea warm, her shawl nearly complete, and the mystery of Redwick Parish Hall laid gently to rest.